I think that it probably is true, although I'm not sure. That's why I put a question mark after the title of this segment. And there's little doubt in my mind, in part because I didn't do Kriyas for all that long. I never decided not to do Kriyas, to stop doing Kriyas, but my Kriyas became more and more sporadic during that year, partially because my mother was hostile to my practice of Kriya Yoga, and also, I suppose, because there wasn't any really good place where I could sit in quiet, undisturbed, for an extended period of time. So I gradually left behind my practice of Kriya Yoga during that year. Nevertheless, Babaji did promise that even a little practice of Kriya Yoga will diminish dire fears. And I'm inclined to believe that it's true, if nothing else, because Yoganandaji affirmed that promise. And why should I believe Yoganandaji? Because I figure that anybody who can come 1,500 miles from California, teach a little boy telepathically to practice Kriya Yoga, deserves a respectful hearing. But more than that, I guess I would have to say that I'm just tired of being wrong. Because every time during my life when I thought that I knew more than the Guru, that I had to figure things out that the Guru didn't know, or that the Guru was wrong about something, turned out I was wrong. There are many examples that I'll cite during the rest of my story, but at the moment I'll convey just two anecdotes. When I first got into SRF, I read that Guruji had said in Boston some many years before that Boston would have a semi-tropical climate in the 21st century. And I read that somewhere soon after I got in SRF, 1973, early 1974. And I thought, oh no, pseudoscience. Well, pseudoscience was one of the reasons why I got out of fundamentalism. The fundamentalist hostility toward evolution and other scientific theories just turned me off, and that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to be a fundamentalist anymore. And now here I am, and Guruji saying that climate change can happen in a century. I thought, well, that's preposterous. Everybody knows it takes many centuries, even thousands of years sometimes, for real climate change to happen. But then one day I was washing dishes, and I was listening to the radio. I was listening to NPR's All Things Considered. They had a long segment, at least 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, on what they labeled as global warming, possible global warming. And they used a term that I had never heard before, greenhouse gases. And they talked about how carbon dioxide would allow the sun's rays to come into the atmosphere, but not the longer waves after they hit the earth and become heat waves. Those infrared rays can't get out through that shield of carbon dioxide. So it acts like a greenhouse, trapping the heat within the atmosphere. It does indeed look like it might be possible for Boston to have a semi-tropical climate sometime in this 21st century. The other anecdote is a little bit more personal, showing how wrong I could be sometimes when I decided that I knew more than the Guru. That anecdote has to do with my shoulder that locked in place for some reason back in the mid-90s, 1995 I believe it was. And it got so bad that I really couldn't get my arm out far enough even to get it over that electric guitar, which has a hard body. It's only about 3 inches thick, I suppose. But I couldn't get my arm out far enough to get it out over that guitar and play the guitar. I went to a couple of doctors and they did this and did that. One of them used electrical stimulation. That seemed to help a little bit. But nothing was working very well. I finally got my arm so it was with exercises and with electrical stimulation and manipulation of the joint and everything else. I was able to get my arm so I could raise it up horizontally, and that was it. Well, that winter in I believe it was 1995, 1996, we went out to California and I went to services as we always do on Sunday morning. That Sunday we went to the Hollywood Temple. And at the end of our services, we practice a little healing ceremony. We say Om for the body, Om for the mind, Om for the soul. And then we send Om, peaceful thoughts out to all the world. And I'm probably thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. And I was pretty skeptical whether or not this really worked because, in the first place, we only have about 5 or 10 minutes of meditation during that hour service. And so nobody's mind is very focused. My mind was not very focused. I probably didn't take it too seriously. And I was skeptical whether or not anything's really going to come out of doing these Om chants, but I would do them anyway because this is part of our morning service. This is part of obedience to the Guru, whether you believe it or not. You should do it. It's a good idea. If you're not too wise. So I was going home for the body, and all of a sudden I felt a warmth in my shoulder and a tingling. It felt very much like when I was getting the electrical stimulation from the machine in the doctor's office. And I thought, I believe I can raise my arm. So I just raised my arm right straight up. I had no trouble whatsoever. And since then I've had perfect mobility in that arm, no stiffness whatsoever. I can reach all the way up to touch my fingers in the back of my back. My left arm has gotten a little bit sore in the intervening years, and I didn't get any miraculous cure. But the point is that, again, I was proved wrong. Even though those Om chants, you might not think anything's happening, something can happen, and it did cure my shoulder virtually instantaneously, and I've never had a trouble again. This has been 13 years since that happened. So I've learned that it's not a good idea to be skeptical of the Guru. It's not a good idea to think that I know better than the Guru knows. And when the Guru says that Kriya Yoga reduces fear, I'm inclined to believe it. Now, be that as it may, perhaps the more interesting question for a psychologist such as myself is, why was I getting beaten in the first place? As I explained during this segment, the precipitating condition that precipitated the beatings was bedwetting. But surely there must have been more to it than that. Nobody's going to beat their children just for bedwetting, I would think. So there must have been some predisposing conditions, and as I indicated, probably the main predisposing condition was my parents' hostility. In my mother's case, her anger against her father. My father also had a lot of anger, possibly from the beatings that he got and the abuse that he got from his father. He had a very bitter childhood. Now, the reason that psychologists believe this, there's a name for this, of course, and it's called displacement. And the reason psychologists believe this is because there's so much evidence in support of it. If you put two rats, for example, I remember this film vividly that I saw as an undergraduate or in my early years as a graduate student in psychology. Put two rats into a cage. Somebody rigged this up in the 50s. Took a film before videotape. Took a film of these rats, and this cage had an electrified grid in the floor. And when you put the rats in, they were just kind of sniffing around like rats do, exploring the space. But then when he turned on the voltage and shocked the rats through their feet, they immediately raised up and attacked one another. And they were going for the throat. These rats meant business. Then when he turned the voltage off, they pretty quickly settled back down. They were just sniffing around, looking around like rats do. And then he turned the voltage back on, and again, instantly they're attacking one another. Pigeons, same way. Fact is, every organism that's been tested shows the same pattern. Pain produces aggression. In human beings, somebody looked at the relationship between the price of cotton and the number of lynchings. And what he showed in his graph was that every time the price of cotton went up, the number of lynchings went down. Every time the price of cotton went down, the number of lynchings went up. Now, obviously, the African Americans who worked on those cotton farms back before the Civil Rights Movement, did they cause the price of cotton to go up and down? Of course not. They were blameless. But nevertheless, they were relatively defenseless. They were available, they were identifiable. Those are the conditions that you need to be a socially acceptable victim. And they were victimized by the whites. Almost every culture, almost every religion, every ethnic group has its own set of socially acceptable victims. In the South, the blacks were the victims for the whites. In Germany during World War II, the Jews were the victims for the Nazis. In Japan, the hairy Ainu were the socially acceptable victims of the Japanese. The hairy Ainu were Caucasians, and so they had hair on their arms, hair elsewhere on their body, in contrast to the Japanese who have not very much body hair. The point is that almost every group, every religious group, every ethnic group, every nationality, every political group, they all have their socially acceptable victims. You know, it's really not necessary to read the research journals in order to understand displaced aggression. When I used to teach this topic in the university, I brought in a comic strip that I had clipped from the newspaper one time. The first panel shows a domestic scene with a grouchy husband complaining to his wife, "Oh, the coffee's cold. The toast is burned. What's the matter with you?" The wife looks like she's not able to defend herself very well, but she's not very happy either. The next panel shows the wife berating the child. "Toys all over the floor. Clothes all over the floor. How many times have I told you?" Of course, the child is not able to defend himself against the mother. But he can kick the dog. The dog can't defend himself, of course, but he can chase the cat. But a few years later, I saw an even better version of this cartoon. Instead of the dog chasing the cat, the dog bit the postman. And then in the final panel of the cartoon, the postman sues the father. I kind of like this because it shows the karma going full circle, coming back to the father. Now, fundamentalists show this pattern much more strongly than do people who are not fundamentalists, because the fundamentalists usually have themselves been the victim of harsh parental treatment during childhood, abuse even. And so it is when I became a fundamentalist, I had a socially acceptable victim that was given to me by the fundamentalist Protestants with whom I lived.